The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty training grounds of Fort Benning, Georgia, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat and tension. Sergeant Marcus Cole stood at attention with his platoon, his worn leather boots barely holding together at the seams. The left sole flapped slightly with each movement, a constant reminder of the financial struggles that had followed him from the trailer parks of rural Alabama to this moment. Marcus had joined the Army at 23, later than most, after spending 5 years working double shifts at a meatpacking plant to support his younger sister through college. His boots were the same ones his father had worn during Desert Storm, passed down like a sacred relic after the old man died from complications related to Agent Orange exposure. They were scuffed, cracked, and held together with duct tape hidden beneath the tongue, but Marcus polished them every single night until they gleamed in the limited ways they still could. Lieutenant Bradley Hutchinson circled the formation like a predator, his pristine uniform and brand-new tactical boots clicking sharply against the concrete. He came from old money, the kind whispered about in country clubs and Ivy League alumni gatherings. His grandfather had been a general, his father a decorated colonel, and Bradley carried that legacy like a golden shield. He stopped directly in front of Marcus, his eyes traveling slowly down to those weathered boots. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth. You planning to walk into combat with those relics, Cole? Or are you saving up for a museum donation? Laughter rippled through the ranks. Private Jensen, a fresh-faced kid from Connecticut, nearly choked trying to suppress his snickering. Even Corporal Matthews, who had shared rations with Marcus during their previous training exercises, couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. Marcus kept his eyes forward, jaw tight. Sir, these boots have served me well, sir. Hutchinson leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that everyone could still hear. Well, isn't the issue here, soldier? Those things look like they survived World War I. What happens when we're in the field and your poverty parade gets you or your team killed? The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Marcus felt heat rise up his neck, not from anger but from the deep, gnawing shame of being poor in a world that equated worth with wealth. He had grown up watching his mother stretch every dollar until it screamed, wearing hand-me-downs until they literally fell apart, eating government cheese and being grateful for it. The Army was supposed to be his escape, his chance to prove that determination mattered more than a bank account balance. But here, even here, his poverty was a punchline. The training schedule posted that morning had sent waves of anxiety through the entire company. Advanced mine detection and clearance exercises in Sector 7, the most realistic combat simulation zone on the entire base. Real deactivated mines, authentic pressure plates, tripwires configured exactly as they appeared in conflict zones from Afghanistan to Somalia. One mistake in identification could mean failure. Multiple mistakes could mean a training injury serious enough to end a military career before it truly began. Hutchinson addressed the platoon with the confidence of someone who had never truly failed at anything. Tomorrow morning, 0500 hours, we enter the minefield. This exercise separates the soldiers from the pretenders. Your ability to read terrain, identify threats, and move with precision will determine whether you advance to explosive ordnance disposal training or get reassigned to inventory management in some warehouse in Kansas. He turned back to Marcus. Especially you, Cole. Try not to trip over those boot soles. Wouldn't want your vintage footwear to be the reason you step on something that goes boom. More laughter. Marcus swallowed hard, tasting copper and humiliation. That evening, in the barracks, Marcus sat on his bunk carefully applying another layer of polish to his father's boots. The leather was so worn in places that it barely absorbed the wax anymore, but he tried anyway. Around him, other soldiers joked and played cards, but Private Danny Reeves approached quietly and sat down beside him. Reeves was from Detroit, had grown up in foster care, and recognized the specific type of shame that came from being mocked for circumstances beyond your control. Man, don't let Hutchinson get in your head. Those boots don't define what you can do out there. Marcus nodded but didn't look up. My dad walked through hell in these, cleared mines in Kuwait, saved his entire unit when everyone said he was too old, too slow, too much of a country boy to handle the pressure. Then tomorrow you show them what those boots really mean, Reeves said firmly. You show them that skill isn't something you buy at a store. Marcus finally looked up, meeting his friend's eyes. What if he's right? What if I'm not good enough? Reeves stood and placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. Brother, I've watched you study those mine identification manuals like they're scripture. You know things the rest of us are still struggling to memorize. Your eyes see details others miss. Tomorrow isn't about money. It's about mastery. As lights out was called and darkness filled the barracks, Marcus lay awake staring at the ceiling. His boots sat beside his bunk, ready for the test that would either validate everything he believed about himself or confirm his deepest fears. Outside, the Georgia night sang with crickets and distant artillery practice. Somewhere out there, a minefield waited. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence at 4:30. Marcus was already awake, had been for an hour, mentally rehearsing every mine identification technique he had memorized. Type 72 anti-personnel mines, VS-50s, M14s, the subtle differences in pressure plate configurations, the way disturbed soil looked different from naturally settled earth. The platoon assembled in full gear as the sky began to lighten from black to deep purple. Hutchinson arrived in a military vehicle, stepping out with theatrical precision. Behind him, 3 senior instructors emerged, clipboards in hand. This wasn't just training anymore. This was evaluation. This would go in their permanent files. The minefield stretched before them like a nightmare made tangible. 200 yards of Georgia red clay, marked only by entrance and exit points. Somewhere in that expanse lay 47 training mines, their locations known only to the instructors. The rules were simple and brutal. Identify every mine in your assigned corridor, mark it properly, and navigate to the other side. Miss one and you fail. Trigger one and you're done. Hutchinson read names from a roster, assigning each soldier their corridor. He saved Marcus for last, his voice dripping with performative concern. Cole, you get corridor 7. It's got the highest concentration of devices. Figured you might appreciate the extra challenge, given your experience with hand-me-downs. Corridor 7. Marcus felt his stomach drop. Even the instructors exchanged glances. That corridor had a 90% failure rate in previous training cycles. The first 5 soldiers went before him. Jensen made it halfway before missing a VS-50 buried just beneath a thin layer of leaves and was immediately pulled from the course, his face pale with failure. Matthews identified 8 mines successfully but triggered a pressure plate on his 9th step, the loud buzzer signaling his elimination echoing across the field like a death knell. When Marcus's turn came, every eye was on him. Hutchinson stood with arms crossed, that familiar smirk playing on his lips. Remember, Cole? Slow and steady. Though I'm not sure those boots will give you the ground feel you need. Maybe you should have invested in proper equipment instead of relying on nostalgia. The comment drew snickers from several soldiers. Even one of the instructors, a captain named Morrison who golfed with Hutchinson's father, barely suppressed a smile. Marcus approached the entrance marker, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. The morning sun was rising now, casting long shadows across the field. He thought about his father, about the stories the old man used to tell about clearing mines in the desert, about how he could feel the earth speaking to him through his boots, telling him where death waited. He took his first step into the corridor, and the world fell silent except for the sound of his breathing and the whisper of disturbed air around him. Marcus moved like water, each step deliberate and measured. His eyes scanned the ground with an intensity that made everything else disappear. 3 steps in, he stopped. The soil ahead showed a subtle circular depression, barely visible in the morning light. He knelt carefully, brushed away a thin layer of dirt with his fingers, and revealed the edge of a Type 72 anti-personnel mine. He marked it with a small orange flag and continued. Behind him, Hutchinson's smirk began to fade. 7 steps later, Marcus paused again. The other soldiers might have missed it, but he noticed how the morning dew had settled differently on one patch of ground, the moisture pattern interrupted by something beneath. Another mine, another flag. His worn boots seemed to sense the earth in ways the expensive tactical footwear couldn't, the thin soles allowing him to feel every subtle change in density and texture. By the time Marcus reached the 20-yard mark, He had identified and marked 11 mines. The silence among the observers had shifted from mockery to something else entirely. Tension, respect, disbelief. Reeves stood at the sideline, his fists clenched in silent support. Come on, brother. Show them what real skill looks like. Marcus encountered his most difficult challenge at the corridor's midpoint. The ground ahead looked completely uniform, untouched, safe. But something felt wrong. He stood perfectly still for nearly 2 minutes, studying the terrain from every angle. The instructors began to murmur, checking their watches. Hutchinson leaned toward Morrison and whispered something that drew a chuckle. Then Marcus saw it. The way the grass blades tilted, almost imperceptibly, influenced by ground disturbance from weeks ago that had never fully settled. He approached from an angle, tested the soil with a probe, and found not 1 but 3 mines clustered together in a pattern designed to catch soldiers who relaxed after clearing an easy section. Triple threat configuration, he called out clearly. VS-50s in triangular formation, spacing approximately 8 inches. The senior instructor, Major Williams, actually stepped forward to verify. He examined the area and then looked up at Marcus with undisguised amazement. That's correct, soldier. First trainee to identify that pattern in 2 years. Something shifted in that moment. The laughter died completely. Even Hutchinson's expression had hardened into something unreadable. Marcus continued forward. Each step was a conversation between his feet and the earth below, a dialogue his father had taught him was possible if you paid attention, if you respected the ground and what it held. These boots, worn and broken as they appeared, had walked through real minefields, had developed creases and flex points that told stories of survival. If you're watching this and rooting for Marcus right now, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. Because what happens next will show you that sometimes the most underestimated person in the room is exactly the one you should never doubt. This is just the beginning of his redemption. Marcus was now 3/4 through Corridor 7, having identified 23 mines without a single error. His movements had become almost meditative, a rhythm that bordered on the supernatural. The instructors had stopped checking their clipboards and simply watched, witnessing something they had rarely seen in decades of training soldiers. Hutchinson's jaw was tight, his arms no longer crossed but hanging stiffly at his sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. Cole was supposed to fail, to prove that poverty and hand-me-downs had no place among the elite. Instead, he was executing a masterclass in mine detection. The final section of Corridor 7 contained what the instructors called the Judas Stretch, a 15-foot span that appeared completely clear but held the highest concentration of devices, designed to make soldiers overconfident and careless after surviving the earlier challenges. 17 soldiers had failed at this exact spot over the past 6 months. Marcus stopped at its entrance and closed his eyes. Around him, the Georgia morning had fully awakened with birdsong and warming air, but he heard none of it. He was somewhere else entirely, in a memory of his father sitting on their trailer's porch, teaching him about patience and observation. Son, your daddy told him years ago, the earth always tells the truth if you listen. Rich folks think expensive equipment makes them better, but technology can fail. Your senses, your instincts, your willingness to take your time, those never lie. Marcus opened his eyes and began the final approach. 2 steps in, he stopped. The grass ahead showed no disturbance, but the ground had a slightly different color, a shade that suggested recent digging filled back in carefully. He probed and found a mine buried deeper than the others, designed to defeat shallow searches. Flag planted. For more steps. Another pause. This time he noticed how a small rock sat at an unnatural angle, placed deliberately to hide a trip wire mechanism. He traced the wire with his eyes, found the secondary device it connected to, and marked both. 2 flags. The observers were now completely silent. Even the morning breeze seemed to hold its breath. Marcus reached the final 10 feet. His worn boots had carried him through hell without faltering, and now they would carry him to victory. But then he saw it, the ultimate test. A pressure plate disguised beneath what looked like solid clay, positioned exactly where a relieved soldier would place their final confidence step before reaching the exit marker. He knelt down one last time, his father's boots pressing gently into the Georgian soil. With careful precision, he marked the final mine and then stepped deliberately to the left of it, planting his foot on verified safe ground. One more step, then another. And then Marcus Cole crossed the exit line of Corridor 7, having identified every single mine without error, something no trainee had accomplished in the entire history of Fort Benning's advanced mine training program. The silence lasted 3 heartbeats before Major Williams began to clap. The applause started with Major Williams and spread like wildfire through the assembled soldiers and instructors. Even the hardened veterans who had seen countless trainees attempt and fail Corridor 7 couldn't contain their amazement. Reeves was shouting, his voice cracking with emotion. Matthews, despite his own earlier failure, was clapping so hard his palms turned red. Marcus stood at the exit marker, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face. His legs trembled from the sustained tension, but he remained upright, shoulders back. He had done it, not despite his worn boots, but perhaps because of them. Major Williams approached him, hand extended. Soldier, in 32 years of training personnel in mine detection, I have never witnessed a perfect clearance of Corridor 7. Your performance today was nothing short of extraordinary. Marcus shook his hand, his voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, sir. My father taught me well. The major nodded with understanding. Those boots tell a story, son. And today you honored that story beautifully. Hutchinson stood frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. The smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame struggling against stubborn pride. The other soldiers who had laughed earlier now avoided his gaze, suddenly aware of how cruel their mockery had been. Captain Morrison, the instructor who had golfed with Hutchinson's family, approached Marcus next. His tone had completely changed from the dismissive amusement of earlier. Cole, we'd like to recommend you for accelerated placement in the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Program. Your spatial awareness and attention to detail are exactly what we need in the field. Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, a dam of years of accumulated doubt and shame finally breaking. Sir, I would be honored. As the platoon was dismissed, Hutchinson finally approached Marcus. The walk across the training ground seemed to take forever, each step a visible struggle. When he finally stood before Marcus, his voice was tight and formal. Cole, I owe you an apology. I judged you based on appearance rather than capability. That was wrong, and it goes against everything the Army stands for. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. The easy thing would be to accept graciously and move on. But something in him needed to say what had been building all morning. Sir, those boots belong to my father. He was a mine clearance specialist in Desert Storm. He came from nothing, wore hand-me-downs his entire life, and saved 17 men when a convoy hit an unmarked minefield outside Kuwait City. He taught me that skill isn't something you buy. It's something you earn through dedication, humility, and respect for the craft. Hutchinson's face flushed. Your father sounds like a remarkable man. He was, Marcus replied quietly. And these boots remind me every day that where you come from doesn't determine where you're going. 3 years later, Staff Sergeant Marcus Cole stood in a conference room at the Pentagon, his uniform decorated with commendations that told stories of courage and expertise. The worn boots had been retired, placed in a shadow box on his apartment wall alongside his father's military portrait and the orange flags from that defining day at Fort Benning. But he wore their successor now, a new pair that he was carefully breaking in, creating new stories with every mission. Marcus had become one of the Army's most respected explosive ordnance disposal specialists, having successfully cleared over 300 improvised explosive devices in 2 deployments to Afghanistan. His techniques had been studied and incorporated into updated training manuals. Young soldiers now learned the Cole method of terrain reading, named after the quiet kid from Alabama who had once been mocked for his poverty. He was at the Pentagon to receive the Army Commendation Medal for his work training the next generation of EOD specialists. In the audience sat Major Williams, now promoted to Colonel, and Danny Reeves, who had followed Marcus into EOD and become his closest friend and frequent mission partner. Also in attendance, sitting in the back row, was Bradley Hutchinson. He had requested permission to attend, and Marcus had granted it without hesitation. Hutchinson had never quite recovered from that day at Fort Benning, the shame of his mockery haunting him in ways that pushed him to become better. He had spent the past 3 years working with veteran support organizations, helping soldiers from difficult backgrounds access the equipment and resources they needed. It was his penance, his way of making amends for the cruelty he had once embodied. After the ceremony, they spoke briefly in the hallway. Hutchinson extended his hand. "Congratulations, Marcus. You've accomplished more than most of us ever will." Marcus shook it firmly. "We all have our journeys, Bradley. Thank you for coming." That evening, Marcus visited Arlington National Cemetery and stood before his father's grave. The sunset painted the white headstones in shades of gold and amber. He placed his hand on the marble and spoke softly. "We did it, Dad. Those boots carried me exactly where they needed to, and I made sure everyone knows that value isn't measured in dollars." The wind carried his words away across the field of heroes. Marcus had learned that redemption wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about proving yourself right, about holding on to your worth when the world tried to diminish it, about honoring those who came before by becoming everything they hoped you could be. Thank you so much for watching this story until the very end. If it touched your heart or reminded you that determination matters more than circumstances, please hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us about a time when someone underestimated you. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And if you have suggestions for our next story, drop them in the comments. Your support means everything. Until next time, remember, never let anyone make you feel small for where you started. It's where you're going that truly matters.